If the baseline elitism of a bunch of politicians, bureaucrats, central banksters, corporate cronies, and media lapdogs meeting in air-conditioned, expensively catered comfort at the climate cult ritual called COP27 weren't sufficiently noisome to raise a hackle, if the weird occultic symbolism of their strange as above, so below, sun, soil, eye logo thing, if that weren't enough to knit a brow, then this fulfillment of what many of us suspected was the goal of COP27 certainly ought to be of concern. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRCTV. Just announced as the Sharm el-Sheikh Egypt propaganda and petulance party ended, and immediately heralded by the pop media, the Biden administration has signed on to an agreement to funnel at least $1 billion of our and our progeny's tax cash into a climate reparations fund, which will, of course, once it's well-paid managers take their cuts, be showered on countries put at a disadvantage by the first world nations' use of fuel. In other words, by first world nations using that fuel to produce things in a competitive market with greater and greater efficiency and productivity, thus allowing even the poorest countries and the people in them to have better living standards. Yeah, it's something about which Politico is gushing. Quote, countries meeting in Egypt clinched a deal early Sunday that could send billions of dollars from wealthy countries to help developing nations treat the symptoms of climate change. Isn't it nice to see Politico offer this idea that this horde of organized political criminality is, as they term it, countries meeting? And isn't it great to see that Politico writers Zach Coleman and Carl Mathiasen are so jazzed that they use the sporty term clinched, even as they accept the underlying fallacy of anthropogenic climate change, and as they frame it like a disease? Indeed, they seem pleased but not completely satisfied, for still in the mode of medical rhetoric, they add, quote, but the agreement's final text also offered its tacit blessing to natural gas, a fossil fuel that's worsening the underlying disease. Which assumes that there is a disease, and then assumes that natural gas is one of its causes, both being narratives that are not only unproven, but which, as I've noted for MRCTV, are unsupported and have been exposed as products of data manipulating so-called researchers and people who won't even allow courtroom discovery of their original data, sources, or methods. But this hasn't stopped Politico, and it hasn't stopped NBC from cheering like French Revolution socialists around a guillotine. Their journalist, Michal Agarwal, even went so far as to use correlation in an attempt to establish the mirage of causation when it comes to so-called climate change-induced storms. Quote, in a historic first, countries have agreed to set up a fund to help pay for the devastating impact of climate change on poorer nations, according to a deal unveiled on Sunday after marathon talks. It is clearly a down payment on the longer investment in our joint futures, said Sherry Rehman, Environment Minister of the flood-hit Pakistan. The fund was also at the center of delivering climate justice, delegations said. See? First, be sure to accept the notion that climate change is happening beyond what naturally and cyclically occurs on Earth due to variations in solar output. And, of course, when we use climate change, we have to point out that the knitters of this narrative straitjacket actually mean global warming, a term that they dropped when, by 2016, it became clear that there hadn't been any significant warming for nearly 2 decades. Second, assume that flooding anywhere is worse today than it has been in the last 150 years or so. which actually is not the case. In fact, despite the climate doomsayers amping up their rhetoric since the late 1980s, Climate Depot's Mark Morano and statistician and environmental author Bjorn Lomborg both note that 2021 saw the fewest global hurricanes in the satellite era and the second fewest strong hurricanes since 1980. Third, absorb and regurgitate their nonsense term climate justice in the same way the amorphous collectivism of social justice has been adopted by many Americans, allowing, of course, for the justice to be defined by politicians and for them to redistribute wealth as a means of delivering said so-called justice. Yeah, I think we get the picture. But of course, there's more. They also claim this is an investment and down payment. Well, the last time I checked, investment connoted voluntary action, as in a person opted in, vesting his or her own time or property, money, that sort of thing. I didn't know that government effectuated theft and forced redistribution of wealth were investments. And just what will this investment scheme actually do? Well, it's not a treaty, it's a plan. And that term is intentional, as it was with Barack Obama's use of the Paris Climate Accord as a pretext to issue executive orders and regulations that began shutting down the U.S. coal industry and stifling the ability of U.S. interests to refine oil into diesel, gasoline, and kerosene. By not treating this COP27 reparations thing as a treaty, Biden doesn't have to worry about the U.S. Senate rejecting it. With obliqueness galore, he can bandy about the terms international obligations and agreements and accords as cover each time he issues his own unconstitutional executive orders to harm U.S. energy production, or he has his unconstitutional EPA or Department of Energy. Didn't James Madison call for that? Oh no, he didn't. That's right. When he uses them to stop oil exploration, curtail fuel transportation, or hand out pork to so-called green energy interests that, of course, can't make it in the real market if they just ask for our money. If you detect the stench of racketeering via vampiric international political interests, we have a pretty good sense of smell. Like any decent vampire, these forces suck off the productive, and they will not cease their attempts to hypnotize the public into thinking their evil ways are for everyone's good. Which brings us to the last point. Of all things, this reparations for nations hit by weather caused by climate change neglects two key points. First, the use of fossil fuels has allowed for the increasingly more productive capacity of the first world nations to provide products and work to residents of poorer nations, such that their life expectancy and living standards are far, far better now than decades ago. And that would be the time when the neo-Luddite environmental movement really kicked it into high gear, pun intended. If you'd like more information on this, I suggest you watch John Stossel's excellent 2019 Reason video all about rising living standards, how the world is actually getting better. The second point I'd like to make, as is always the situation with redistribution of wealth, by taxing the productive, political forces actually reduce and redirect the usable capital that those productive people should be able to direct as they see fit. They would direct it towards even more areas of discovery, of employment, and of opportunity. Creating this kind of fund will do nothing more than what previous internationalist wealth redistribution schemes have done in the past. They'll fund political elites in those poor nations. They'll strip market participants of their ability to help make good, plentiful, and cheap products, and energy even cheaper. And in the end, they'll harm the real poor people that the politicians purport to help with their fund. How about an alternative? It's one word. It's not used very often anymore. It's called freedom. Hey, thanks so much for watching, everybody. Really appreciate you joining us here at MRC TV. Remember, when you visit MRCTV.org, you'll see the panoply of stories that the whole team is working on. And when you do go to MRCTV.org, just open up another tab, head over. Please donate to the Media Research Center to help us continue this intense work against bias in the media. It's great to know so many people support us. We'd love to see your comments, whether they're on YouTube or, of course, on Rumble. Please subscribe at both. And remember, Rumble does not censor us. We'll see you on the Facebook page, which is always hopping. We'll see you on Twitter. We'll see you on Instagram and Parler, yay Parler, and on TikTok as well. And if you want to find me on Gab, I'm at Gardner Goldsmith. And on Twitter, I'm at Gard Goldsmith. For MRC TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.